the mother of our late Prime Minister, David Thompson, MP. And I ask you to join me in a moment of reverential silence. And of course, we should record for the record that the person in question is Mrs. Margaret Knight, mother of our late Prime Minister David Thompson. The Senate is in session.
Messages from His Excellency the President.
I received the following formal communication from His Excellency the President to the Honourable the Senate, dated 27th of July 2026. His Excellency the President wishes to inform the Honourable the Senate of the death of the Right Excellent Sir Garfield St. Orban Sobers, OCC, National Hero of Barbados, on Friday, 27th of July 2026.
Announcements by Your Honour.
I have several minutes here for confirmation. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I'd like to move that the following minutes of our meetings on the dates that I will list now be confirmed at this time. The minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, the 6th of May, 2026, Friday, the 5th of June, Wednesday, the 10th of June, Wednesday, June 17th, Wednesday, the 1st of July, and Wednesday, the 8th of July, all in 2026.
The question is that minutes of those meetings, Wednesday, May 6th, Friday, 5th June, Wednesday, 10th June, Wednesday, 17th June, Wednesday, 1st July, Wednesday, 8th July, all of 2026, be confirmed. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The next the ayes have it. Those minutes are confirmed. With way of further announcements, I want to inform that Senator Redmond will be joining us online. Senator Malou will be joining us shortly. He's indicated to you. Ah, he's here already. I was looking for you down the aisle. Get you. You've moved up in the world. After so many years, look at that way. But when I saw Senator Slocum, I said, no, that's not Senator Malou. Now, in terms of, we have a number of visitors with us this morning. Just want to recognize the guests of Senator Connell, Mr. Dale Franklin, teacher of the Lord School, there to Senator Connell, and the former students, which he was once a leading example of. Indeed, always a leader. Indeed. If Senator Walker was here, he would confirm. In addition, there's some guests of Her Honour Senator Thompson. If I can just pull the, I've been advised I should give her her full and proper titles. Her Honour, the Most Honourable Ambassador, Senator Henrietta Elizabeth Thompson. And in due season, Yes, there'll be post-nominals like an FB, but there'll be other important post-nominals to be added. I am highly confident in due time. More on that anon. Oh. Her Honourable Senator Thompson has been given of the generosity of her spirit as well as the wealth of her intellect and the wideness of her spirit to assist a number of young people in several ways through mentorship, but particularly in enhancing their capacity to communicate. And we know the capacity of Senator Thompson to communicate in any context, be it calm, a bit more agitated, be it for, anyway, some of that for another place, another time. But we know that. But I want to welcome the following: Denisha Maynard, Jaman Cole, Shadia Smith, Aaron Yard, Remilia Gabriel, Kayanda St. Hill, Shanice Yard, Tremaine Trotman, Jennifer Ford, Amanda Marshall, Rico Anton, Minashi Prasad, Carl Applewaith, Abel Ocanio, Anthony Blackman, and Christopher Bradley, who are here compliments of her honor. Welcome to all of you visitors. And we hope that you'll find your time with us interesting and edifying. And I do hope that some of you will be so enthused and impressed that you will also choose to join us either in this place or the other place as members. So looking forward to that. We all started as non-members before. We were inspired to come along with us. I think those are the announcements for today. So welcome all.
Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers. Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statement by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate are moved by a minister.
The Honourable Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Those against please say no. The ayes have it. Accordingly, Standing Order 45-2 is suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
We commit presentation of papers.
Thirdly,
Presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I am commanded to lay the following document: loan contract number 6097/OC-BA, IDB Klima First Individual Operation Mains Replacement and Non-Revenue Water Reduction Program in Barbados.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the following bills. First, to have the first reading of the Protection of Wages Bill 2026, and to move the first reading of the Beneficial Ownership Transparency and Register Bill of 2026.
The question is that the Protection of Wages Bill 2026 and the Beneficial Ownership Transparency and Register Bill 2026 be read a first time. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The things yes, have it. Those bills are accordingly read a first time.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 2, sir. In
Order
the
number
name of
two.
the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Protection of Wages Bill 2026.
Senator the Honourable Lisa Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to begin today by joining you, Mr. President, in acknowledging the full house in the gallery that we have today. First of all, to recognize the guests of Madam Deputy President. I think we all saw the notice when she published that she was inviting persons to apply for this public speaking course. And I think that while there are many who aspire to this throne, she has occupied it firmly for an extended period of time, where she is known here and abroad as an exemplary speaker who speaks not just substance, but manages to keep your attention all the way through. And so I have absolutely no doubt that you have been in for a treat, and that during the course of today's sitting of the Senate, you will be in for a further treat, seeing her live and live in color in her own environment. I reluctantly want to also acknowledge the guests of Senator Connell, largely because I know that he's only having them here because there were guests from another place not far from this location that filled both sides of the gallery just a short time ago. And so he wants to aspire to do the same thing. But But I do, however, want to acknowledge the students of fifth form of the Lodge School. Welcome. We're happy to have you here with us today. I think that there's obviously a role to be played by all of our young people in nation building. And the fact that you have either signed up to work alongside Madam Deputy President, or you are here as an example to, note what I said, as an example to Senator Connell as opposed to an example for him, is an indication that you are definitely putting your hands to the plow and are willing to put your hands to the plow in service to this nation. And you are the faces that Barbados needs to be able to showcase each and every day, because you are those young people in whose hands we will entrust the future. And I want to welcome you to the Senate chamber today. I also want to take the opportunity, before I get into my presentation, to commend another young person who in this instance is not sitting around the gallery, but is sitting around the table, who in their first outing as Minister of Culture under the Prime Minister's office would have, along with the team at the National Cultural Foundation, led our just concluded crop over festivities. And I want to commend young Minister of Culture in the Prime Minister's office, Minister Shane Archer, who is a member of this chamber. I have said it to him privately, internal to our chat, but I do so now publicly. I have every confidence that the young people of this country who aspire to leadership or who occupy leadership are well placed to do exactly that. And as you sit around the gallery and as you watch Minister Archer and his team, I have every confidence, again, that Barbados is in good hands for our future. Congratulations to you and the culture team, Senator Archer. I'm not sure if Senator Slocum is still considered a young category. But congratulations to you, Senator Slocum, for your performances and your accomplishments in the recently concluded Pickety Crop finals and all of the associated crop over activities. I now want to get into the presentation today. Today is a debate that I think many people have paid a lot of interest in. One, we are beginning to debate at the Senate level, having already passed in the other place, the Protection of Wages Bill. And we're debating the Protection of Wages Bill in an environment where, as a government, between 2018 and today, we have spent a significant amount of time investing in legislative reforms around workers' rights. We've invested in a series of legislation, even during COVID, when we were in the other place, where we were speaking about what types of protections needed to be afforded to workers and what needed to be done in support of workers through employee relationships, employer relationships, the role being played by employers as well and employer rights groups. But we also have spent a lot of time at the international level ensuring that at the level of the International Labour Organization, Barbados is not just walking the walk at home, but we are talking the talk and walking the walk internationally. And so we've seen a lot of this work evolve in collaboration very closely between Barbados at home, the Employers Confederation, the labor unions, all of them, as well as the government. And then you have seen the role of the International Labour Organization globally. But also nationally, we have seen the work of these social partners, the work of the social partnership, having their eyes and their ears and their hands to this plow as well. And the social partnership, for those who are not familiar with the construct, is a construct that came about in the 1990s when Barbados was encountering those difficulties in those very early days in terms of our financial and our fiscal situation. And the social partnership then came about as a consequence of those difficulties and was comprised accordingly: labor, government, and the private sector. And every major decision made by the country at that time in the 1990s came out of discussion and engagement with the social partnership. But here we are in 2026, where we're still having those conversations, and the Honourable Prime Minister would tell you that in 2018, when this government first came to office and we were once again having those financial difficulties, our fiscal space was badly constrained, the very early decisions that this government made in 2018 as a social partnership to save the dollar was made under the umbrella of the social partnership. Labor, government, and the productive sectors all together. And that's where we are here again now. So this piece of legislation that we are amending comes from a different time and place. Before there was a social partnership, before we were speaking about how workers needed to be respected, what workers' rights needed to be enforced, what the relationship needed to be between employer and employee. And as the young people in this room who live on their phones and on their various devices, it lived in an era before digital transactions and digital payments. And so this government, as I started out by saying, that between 2018 has invested significantly and now in legislative reforms, is also the government, at least under the Barbados Labour Party, which in 1951 passed the original legislation that we're now making amendments to under another one of our national heroes, the Right Excellent Sir Grantley Adams. And so this legislation, this 1951 legislation, is being updated to take into account the differences between what existed in 1951 and what we now have in an environment in 2026. In 2026, we now have, as I mentioned before, digital payments. We did not have an instant transfer before of funds. In 2026, and certainly between 2018 and now, we've had these national conversations about how workers could be treated. I put my hands up and say, I never understood why it needed to be a big deal that this government put bathrooms in fields for agricultural workers. I thought, wasn't that always done? But no, it wasn't always done. And the things that we have put into place to make sure that workers are treated with dignity in their place of work, those are the things that are at the heart of changing this legislation. Now, a lot of times when we talk about dignity, we think about things which are overt. But this legislation speaks about many of the things which are not quite always so visible. If you listen to the debate in the other place, who would imagine that some of the accounts that were recapped in the other place would have come up? But they did. And so this legislation is set up for that purpose. How do we treat to the dignity of a person who, whether they are in the fields picking cotton or working in the agricultural fields, or whether they're sitting behind a desk? How do we treat to the dignity of a person if they are working on a construction site with concrete and with sand and metals? How do we make sure that there is the protection of the worker who is in a classroom as a teacher, in a hotel, or as I mentioned before, on a farm? But who would have imagined during COVID that we would have had all kinds of categories of workers that were designated as essential workers, supermarket workers, packing a shelf and making sure that we have food to be able to pick off the shelf and put into our basket and take home. Those are also essential workers, and their dignity through this legislation is being protected. And so fairness, dignity, respect, but for the purposes of legislative reform, clarity and predictability. Bringing 1951 forward to 2026 to ensure all of the things that I have just outlined. So what do we get into now, into the weeds of the legislation itself? This piece of legislation allows for us to cover a range of things. I spoke earlier about the social partnership. The social partnership has created an environment along with our labor union movement, our union movement, things like collective bargaining, severance protection. We have the role being played by the National Insurance Social Service, Social Security, maternity protections. In this, maternity leave and paternity leave very recently. We also have the Safety and Health at Work Act, which talks about the conditions under which people in their work environment have to be maintained. But we generally and genuinely have a mature industrial relations framework. But that's not what originally existed back when the original legislation came about in 1951. So I always say to people, especially young people, each scenario that we encounter includes A plus B times C divided by T. What does T mean? Time. The scenarios of last week may not be the scenarios of this week. The scenarios of 2 years ago may not be the scenarios of today. And most definitely, the scenarios of 2026 are not the scenarios of 1951 when this legislation evolved. And so here we are now making a number of recommendations. Now, here is where I want to take the conversation to be able to make sure that we understand what we have here. What does the bill bring? Before I came to my current ministry, I was Minister of Business for 4 years. And I had the opportunity there to be able to hear from the perspective of business what some of the issues are. Legislation, as you will encounter, does not ever come to cover the ones who do the right thing. They always cover the ones that don't. They always come to create guardrails around the people who, without those guardrails, would take the wrong positions and do the wrong things. So yes, when I was Minister of Business, we had the opportunity to talk with the business community about many of the issues that they are dealing with. I remember sitting with business owners who would be concerned about whether they would make payroll at the end of the month. I remember meeting with business owners who were concerned about the increasing first costs of businesses, to them as business, when they're buying goods from China or Turkey or Vietnam or wherever they're buying their goods from. When those costs go up, businesses then absorb those costs, or alternately, they pass them on to consumers. Or in some instances, worst case scenario, they don't pay workers on time, which is not widespread at all. And so one of the things that we want to be able to see is how we can grow entrepreneurship in this country in an environment where many of the businesses in this country are small and medium-sized enterprises. We want to make sure that we are protecting businesses, legitimate business, but simultaneously that we're working with businesses to give them clarity so that they in turn protect workers. And responsible employers are what we're hoping for. So that brings me to the bill itself. I want to be able to go through the bill with you, and I'm going to take you through the various sections of the bill at this time. In the first instance, under Section 3, I'm going to go directly to that. It talks about wages to be paid in legal tender. What is the definition of legal tender? That is captured in Section 2, where the interpretations are there. But the legal tender, it tells you that you are able to collect your wages in the salary, in the currency of the country, for example. So imagine if you are paying a worker, you have to be able to pay your workers in Barbadian currency, legal tender. But it also does not allow you to say, I'm giving you these 2 sheep in lieu of your salary payment, right? You have to pay them in legal tender. Then there are exemptions that are covered in Section 4. It tells you the circumstances under which this is done. Agreements in the way in which wages are to be paid. Timing. If you go onto the government treasury's website now, you will find a schedule for the entire year, 2026. You will find 2025. You will find every year before. And on January 1, if not before, you will find 2027. There is a published list of the dates for persons who are receiving wages. If you are paid on a weekly basis and you are a government employee, we publish when you will get those wages. If you are a bi-monthly paid employee, every 2 weeks, you have a published list of when those paydays are. If you are a monthly paid employee, there is a published date on which your salary is to be paid. If you are a pensioner, you have the pensions also listed in a publicly available document for all government workers so that there's predictability. So that when you are planning your monthly obligations, you know if I am a weekly paid worker, I am getting my wage on Friday. This is how much my wage is supposed to be. And then I am able to commit my wage to whatever my obligations are, and I'm able to meet those obligations, whether it is to rent, if it is to pay school fees, if it is to pay child support, if it is to go to the supermarket. I know I am off from work on Saturday, I get paid on Friday, I am going to the supermarket on Saturday morning to buy my child's school things because school is on Monday. I know that when I get paid on a monthly basis, let's say in July, I'm going to put aside X amount of money, and then when I get paid in August, I'm going to put aside X amount of money because school starts in September. So I got to buy school uniforms, I got to buy school shoes, I got to buy games clothes. So I'm going to put aside this money so that I can save it up a little bit and spend on my own personal obligations. Giving a published date for wages, whether bi-monthly or on a weekly basis, and for salaries, is about giving workers predictability and allowing them to plan. Then we move on to the payment, the deduction of wages for advancement by employer. Sometimes people may have issues. Somebody may have an unplanned or unexpected emergency. Not everybody in this country has an emergency fund. There are a lot of people who are going paycheck to paycheck, and so they have to be able to have access to cash. And there are employers who they will go to and say, my friend, my boss, sir, Mr. So-and-so, I run into some trouble this month. My child got sick and I had to buy some medication that I wasn't able to get from anywhere else. And so I need a little advance because I'm a little short this month. When the employer says, yes, I can pay you your wage early, or I can pay you your biweekly wage early. When you get that money in hand, you have to obviously forego the time. You may have to forego the time, but you can't then turn around, and if you have to give people some advance on their money, you cannot, under this legislation, take it back out all one time, because then you're putting people back to square one. You cannot do that. You cannot turn around and charge people interest for advance payments. The legislation does not allow you to do that, because it is money which they have earned. And so you are simply giving it to them earlier than the published or the scheduled time, but it is their money anyhow. But you also can't straddle people. That's very much a Barbadian word. For those who are here, I know one of us at least is not a Barbadian, so the word may sound a little strange, but you can't upset people's planning by taking money back from them all at once. Illegal advances are to be irrecoverable. We already have covered that a little bit. And then I want to go to the question of overpaid wages or debts. Sometimes accounting errors take place. Sometimes there are glitches. What I am saying to you, though, is that when you have a glitch and you have been overpaid, if you know that your salary or your monthly or weekly pay is usually $400 or $500, and suddenly $20,000 appears in your bank account, you know that had an error. You know there was a mistake. Do not spend more than is your due. Do not take it up and decide you're going to spend it because it just appeared in your bank account. You know that something going wrong. No, don't spend it. Don't spend it. No, unlike what my colleagues are here saying, we do not say thank you, Jesus, and go spend the money. It belongs to somebody else. It does. It does. You leave the money that is not yours in your account. Don't touch it. You spend what you know is yours. But even so, God forbid you do the wrong thing and you decide that you have $500 that you are due and you end up spending $700 because you weren't keeping track. Sometimes it happens, especially when you're swiping all the time and you're not always paying full attention. Instead of your account, your card being declined, a payment gets approved when it really ought not to have been if you were spending only what you were given, what you were accustomed to. But you got extra money in your account and the payment goes through. The person who made the error under this legislation cannot decide that because you had an overpayment that they're going to take it out of your salary all in one go. They can't do that. They have to be able to make sure that you still have the ability to live, because this legislation is about giving people dignity and seeing people where they are. Imagine if you were making $500 a week and that's what you were accustomed getting in your hand, and somehow you have spent $700 a week, but that $500 represents rent, the portion you're going to put aside for rent. It represents your supermarket money. It represents your light bill. It represents what portion you're going to put to your water bill. It represents how much money you're going to put on credit, on your phone, on your data, and perhaps any hire purchase agreements that you may have with any company down in town. So imagine if someone takes all of that money out one time and all of a sudden, come next pay period, you have a zero balance. All of a sudden, you are now indebted to everybody else that you owe. Your children can't go to school. You can't pay your light bill. You can't pay your water bill because there's an overpayment. They have to, under this legislation, come to an agreement with you as to how they will recover the monies that you have overspent. And so that is something that could very easily happen, especially for people who are not always watching their accounts. The young people in this room, many of you who are around here, you are always on your devices, and so you always, when I send my goddaughter or anybody else money, for example, she'll send me a message almost instantly, and she'll say, "Thank you, Auntie," because she's always on her phone. She can notice immediately somebody else, especially in a different age group, who is not paying that close attention, yes, Madam Deputy President, may not see that. They may not see, they may not notice. So it can happen. It can happen legitimately, and they may make a genuine error. This legislation protects you from genuine error. And so that's why I wanted to separate whether you spend more than you actually know on purpose or if you spend it accidentally. All right? Wages are not to be paid, well, wages are to be paid in case of bankruptcy and insolvency. I spent some time speaking to the Minister of Finance on this particular clause because this legislation, like all legislation, a little bit of a lesson in governance, no legislation in the country is read in isolation. Every piece of legislation is read alongside other existing pieces of legislation, and you oftentimes will find, as you will see in section 32 of this bill, consequential amendments. So there are consequential amendments to other pieces of legislation in order to give effect to what is contained here, but there are other pieces of legislation to cover different aspects of the legislation that the legislation must be read alongside with. So this piece of legislation must be read alongside with a couple of things. The Employment Rights Act, for example, and if you go to section 17, it must also be read, for example, alongside with the Insolvency Act. And the Insolvency Act, it is my understanding, is currently being updated. There is a draft which is in process. And so I had the opportunity in preparation for today's debate to spend some time talking with the Minister of Finance on this piece of legislation. So you have the Employment Rights Act I've spoken about. You have all of the other pieces of legislation that are relevant, including but not limited to the Insolvency Act. But in the event that a company goes insolvent, and we have seen recent cases where a company has gone insolvent, what happens then? Company just shut down, they shut the doors and go along about their business, and the people who have been working with them for 5 years or 20 or 45 years no longer have any recourse to what is owed to them. That's where the role of a labor union becomes super important. That's where the role of the Labor Department becomes super important, and we encourage persons in all instances to revert to those two entities, your labor union and the Labor Department. But there's an obligation being placed on companies in those circumstances. If I am a company that is selling bottles of water, like these ones, and I go out of business, I have creditors to pay. People who have given me 30 days or 90 days credit to settle my bills, and I have to pay them. So I'm always carrying receivables on my balance sheet. And those as your first order priority are those for workers. Wages, salaries, outstanding vacation monies, any gratuities that are due. So in the insolvency legislation, you have an order of creditors. And the first order in the insolvency legislation is your workforce. This legislation also prioritizes that. You have to pay your workers first. You can't just pick up and go on about your business and leave workers hanging. So think about it. If we talked about if you overspend and this money is in your account, it matters. It matters if you are left exposed. It equally matters if from 1 month to the next, you expect you have a job. You have signed up for rental obligations for a house that you live in. You've signed up for mortgage obligations for a house that you now are working, paying off towards ownership of. You now have children that you have to be sending to school. You got little children in nurseries. You plan to go to the supermarket, and then boom. You go to work one morning and you hear the company shut down or the company is shutting down, and all of those obligations that you had planned for have gone through the window. This legislation protects workers in those circumstances. It says whoever else you need to pay out, whether it is by the use of business interruption insurance provisions that you may have paid into that will cover your creditors, whatever the mechanisms are that you have to pay your workers first, right? This legislation also collides with the National Insurance and Social Security scheme, because as you remember, during COVID, you had a number of persons who were severed and so on as companies had difficulty, and the Social Security scheme allowed for a percentage of the monies to be recovered from the employers. But even in those circumstances, you have to pay your workers first. So again, do not ever read legislation in isolation. It collides with multiple other pieces of legislation and a number of regulatory arrangements adjacent to legislation to be read together. Now, it speaks also in sections 23 through 21, and then 22 and 23 about what happens in certain circumstances. If there is a breach of the legislation, it is covered in Section 20, and then it establishes the Employment Rights Tribunal, which already exists. We know what the Employment Rights Tribunal does. They're permanent, standing Employment Rights Tribunal that treats to issues relating to labor and to workforce complaints. That is covered through 20 to 21. And then I spoke earlier about the role of the Ministry of Labor and the labor unions. It speaks then about the action to be taken by the Chief Labor Officer and the tribunal upon receipt of a complaint, and then what happens in terms of the determination. Finally, if you're speaking about the tribunal, it has the role to be played in enforcement of the act. Now, no legislation must come without enforcement. No legislation must not have an enforcement provision, and so this legislation, Act Section 24, speaks about enforcement. So too does Section 25, offenses and penalties. But inherent in these sections of the legislation are two principles that you will see all across legislation that the government brings: the right to be heard and the right to appeal. You have a right to be heard when you want to raise legitimate concerns about how an employer has engaged with you in terms required by the legislation. If that has happened, if it has not happened, you have a right to be heard. And if I can put it into simple terms, it simply means if you are in your classroom on any given day, or if you're on your job on any given day, and someone comes up to you and it says, so-and-so and so-and-so did something to me, you can't automatically then just, as some persons in here, whether they be principals, teachers, deputy principals, or otherwise, as some persons in here would know, you can't just decide that you're going to punish that person being complained for. You have to give the person who is being accused of wrongdoing the right to be heard. And that's the role of the tribunal. It gives everyone the opportunity to benefit from the basic principle of natural justice. And so people have a right to be heard, and then only after all parties have been heard, then a decision is made. And then whether or not they're right, whether they're right or wrong, will be determined. And then you can look at the offenses and penalties. And let me just pause here for a moment to say this. When I talk about the right to be heard, and when I talk about the right of appeal and thinking about natural justice, I spoke earlier about young people and your devices. This is social media. This is social media where you could come and say the wildest things on social media, knowing you to defend themselves, but then everybody jumps on a bandwagon because that is what is said on social media, and it must be true, and there must not be anything else but what you see on social media, because that is on social media, and that's what I'm saying. And worse yet, especially when we're talking about workers, worse yet, they don't like this body, they don't like we, they don't like black people, they don't like poor people, they don't like workers, they don't like all kinds of people. And so automatically, there is a narrative that is perpetuated because one person has given an account. That I'm telling you, a lot of times, especially when dealing with government can't respond. And companies can't respond. Government can't answer. And so you run down the road with all kinds of narrative that may or may not be true in their entirety. And I appeal to you as young people, be very discerning about what you see being presented in social media or sometimes in other quarters. Chances are you are seeing 10% of the story. You do not know what else is at play. So when you start to circulate and you send all these viral voice messages or these screenshots of these online appeals, or you are bombarding people's phones with these screenshots of messages, can you do this, can you do that, this person is being unfair. Trust me when I tell you, you never know the full story, and there's often more to it than you would know. So the principle of natural justice, when talking about the workforce, is important in the context of the tribunal. And we are encouraging everyone to use the services of the tribunal. There are many people who do, and to ensure that you give the employer the right to be heard. And if you're dissatisfied with the outcome of the work of the tribunal, you have automatically the right to appeal. All right? Good. Now, the provisions of this legislation also cover something that we have included all across legislation, whether it is with regard to dilapidated buildings, whether it is with regard to the maintenance of open lots, whatever it is. This legislation is not just for the private sector. This is not an instance where you say, do as I say, not as I do. This legislation binds the state. It binds the state. It also says to the government itself, you can do any of the things that you are purporting to tell the private sector not to do. And so we are bound by this. There's a section in this piece of legislation that I want to spend a moment on very quickly. Anybody who has gone for a mortgage, anybody who has gone for any kind of loan has encountered the direct deductions framework. If I go for a mortgage, I am going to my bank. When I went for my mortgage, for example, I don't pay my bank myself. It automatically is deducted from my account, but not because the bank says so, but because I have signed an authorization form that says I authorize $2 to be deducted from my account on a monthly basis. And let's go back to that predictability of the date for your salary, your bi-monthly payday, or your wages. I agree that on the 21st of every month, the 26th of every month, this amount is going to be deducted from my account to pay my mortgage. Or equally, that I authorize that this amount is going to be deducted from my account to pay my insurances. That's what you do. Equally so, if you have a hire purchase arrangement and you go to a commercial institution and you say, I want to pay X amount, this is what the amount is supposed to be, and you have to pay this amount, I authorize you and my employer to deduct this amount on this date every month. That has always been the case, and this legislation does not change that. But what it does do is that it insists that it has to be with your consent. Consent. So we've had instances where, and I'm sure you know of these cases, where somebody wants to garnish your account or someone wants to make you pay them first. And without your consent, this money is deducted from your account, and you have no means of saying, but I didn't agree to that. How does, and you got to fight to get it back. Or you have to fight to say, well, who told you you could do that? This legislation says any deductions from your account must be with your express and written permission. And that is what is covered here. And so we want to make sure that persons are protected because a wage or a salary belongs to the employee. The employee alone determines where their monies are to be deposited, and it also tells you how much is supposed to be deposited at that time. There are a couple of things that have happened along the way, two things that I want to speak about. In 1951, we did not have the amendments that have been made to legislation in foreign currency permits, for example, or for foreign currency accounts. When I spoke earlier about the amount being paid in legal tender, here we are in this environment where the employee can benefit from monies being paid in foreign currency if the employer has a foreign currency account and the employee has a foreign currency account. Now, where would that be necessary? For those of us who work for the government of Barbados, or for those of us who work for local companies, that may not be applicable. But this is still a country that has an international business sector, or that has a global business sector, where there are many people who may live and work here for a global company, and they have foreign exchange accounts for that reason. This legislation does allow for those payments, salaries in particular, in this instance, to be paid into a foreign currency account maintained by the employee. So here we go. This again is an example of us reinventing where we were in 1951 to where we are now in 2026. There's another element that I want to speak about very quickly. And I know when it was spoken about in the other place, people were very surprised. People didn't understand what I'm talking about. Why would they say that? But they spoke about in the other place, and over the last few years, it's come up on more than one occasion from us as a government, where legislation we talked about earlier is set to put guardrails around persons who are inclined to do the wrong thing. Now, could you imagine going to work, deciding that you are going to work on time, you're doing what you have to do, and then when you get to work, you are terminated. You are told by your employer, don't come back here, you are being fired, summarily dismissed, and given the runaround to get your money over a period of time. Because you are still due vacation, you were summarily dismissed, and so you have to be paid out under the legislation, Employment Rights Act, read together. And so you turn back up at your workplace on the day that they tell you to come back, and they say, look here, come, we got your money here, come and get your money. You are entitled to $240-something in outstanding monies, and they pay you in coins. I don't know if it was 25-cent pieces, I don't know if it was dollar coins, I don't know if it was 10 cents, 5 cents, or if it was back in the time where we still have 1 cent. I don't know what coin, what currency we use, but it was all in coins. Could you imagine carrying $200-something in coins? I think that, and I think that I've heard it said elsewhere, there are some things for which I am always likely to give persons the benefit of the doubt. I try to be magnanimous in my assumptions about human behavior. I do not automatically assume that someone set out to do the wrong thing. But it is very difficult when you hear about someone getting $240-something in 100% coins after being given the runaround, after being summarily dismissed, to assume that there was anything magnanimous about that act and that it was not maliciously done. That happened in this country to a worker. And so what happens when I get $200-something in coins and I still got to pay bus fare? That may work for bus fare, but how am I going to use that to pay my light bill? How am I going to use that to pay my portion of the water bill? How am I going to take that down the road to Uniforms Unlimited to buy a new pants for my son to go to school? Coins made it infinitely more difficult for that employee to be able to go about their normal course of business. And so this legislation was created to create guardrails around potential banditry, because that's what you would describe that as, banditry, where that could not happen to another person moving from their former place of employment, catching the van or the bus with $240-something in coins weighing them down in their pockets. That's wickedness. That was wickedness. And it rose to the occasion of such wickedness that it found its way in the legislation, never to be done again. And so there are caps in this legislation that tell you how much can be paid in coins up to the massive amount of $10. I think that's reasonable. You cannot pay more than $10 in coins. So never again will we have an environment where that happens to someone else. So overall, I want to just bring some attention briefly as I come to closing on a couple of things. One, I want to go back very quickly to the relationship that we have with industrial relations partners. We have an extensive relationship with our industrial relations partners in the social partnership, but certainly under the leadership of the Minister with responsibility for labor. We have the Employment Rights Tribunal that is there, and we have robust discussions in the social partnership. We talk about all kinds of things. Sometimes we have robust discussions. Sometimes we don't always agree, but that we talk about it and that we practice constructive conflict management is important, and that exists, Mr. President. I want to bring to your attention one other thing. It is about the society that we are trying to build. Who are we as a people? Who are we as a nation? This is a country that talks about the balance of rights and responsibilities. Rights to people, responsibilities of people. So workers, they have rights And employers, they also have rights, but all of them together have responsibilities. And I deliberately have framed my comments today in a way that does not set up an antagonistic relationship between labor and capital. And I do that on purpose. Without employers, there would be no employees. Without employers making revenue, there would be no expenditure on payroll. Without employers doing well in business, there would be no opportunity to increase employment levels in this country. And so there can be no antagonistic relationship between the two. There cannot be. And I'll give a recent example. I think everybody knows that over the last week or so, when we had the state funeral, there were some traffic closures. And I remember sitting in the National Organizing Committee meeting where we were talking about how we would manage the traffic closures for businesses. And as you know, Bridgetown was largely affected. And so we sat with the team, and I remember saying to them at the time, look, everybody in here is an employee largely of the government. But if you work for the private sector, what will happen is that chances are, if we reduce the revenue or the operations of the business community, it impacts their earnings. You impact their earnings, you impact the people who work in those companies, because then the companies are under strain. So we want to make sure, even when we're talking about transport, where the buses would run and how long streets would be closed, we want to make sure that people could get to work. We want to make sure that people can get to and from their homes and to their workplaces, because a day's loss of wages is significant to somebody. So we wanted to make sure that we minimize the pressure on employers and on workers to be able to move freely. And so that's why we then ended up with what you saw. When the parade moved off, for example, from Independence Square, everything behind that area opened back up. When we got to Heroes Square, once that parade moved off and proceeded down Broad Street, everything behind it opened back up. Buses started to flow frequently back over to the Fairchild Street area. Once the Heroes Square area had been cleared and we got down to Jubilee Gardens, then let's keep moving, and everything behind it opened back up. And by the time we hit 10 o'clock in the morning, and we expected to be on the inside of Kensington Oval, everything on the route into Kensington Oval and behind it, especially in that Fontebelle area on that side by the Nation Publishing, everything on that side had to open back up. Because there is a balance to be struck between employers and employees, workers and their employers, making sure that you think at all times about how to make life easier for people. By the time the funeral was over, we knew that on the other side, heading over to the Passage Road side, that would be the area in question. But once everyone was on the inside, traffic flowed freely, Mighty Griner Highway opened right back up. But then once the parade came out of Kensington Oval, then you open that back up immediately. But we could not, as a team, say, well, it's a state funeral, what do I expect? There's going to be inconvenience. No, we couldn't do that, because the balance between employers and workers needed to be struck. Buses needed to move. And those people who work on weekly paid arrangements and are depending on that day's pay still had to be accounted for. We still had to think about the people who are not sitting down comfortably with an automatic monthly payment of their salary in their accounts. So even in those things, we as a government thought about people, balancing the needs of people, the rights of people, and the responsibilities that we have as a government to look out for all. And so as I close, this is important legislation. It brings us forward from 1951 into the modern era of 2026. It allows us to reconcile the need for dignity as at 2026 that may not have been the same as the harsh conditions that led to the 1930s riots, or may have existed when this legislation was first introduced by Sir Grantley Adams in 1951. It brings into modern incarnation the different ways in which money moves and payments move and transactions are conducted in a very digital and technology-forward way. But at the center of it is about preserving dignity and the rights of workers while giving clarity to employers so that as they move forward, they are at all times clear on what the provisions allow for. There have been consultations held with the labor movement. There have been consultations led under the Barbados Employers Confederation in a workshop with employers to be able to take them through what this legislation provides so that they are in a position to operate accordingly. And there's meant to be a communications campaign led by the Ministry of Labour and all of the partners and stakeholders on the legislation to ensure that workers themselves are familiar with the provisions. This is a government that is anchored in workers. This is a government you have heard the Prime Minister speak about that the Barbados Workers Union was born out of and has returned within it again by way of the General Secretary being elected as a member of Parliament once again. This is a government that has, or a Barbados political party that has at the center of its name the Barbados Labour Party. It prioritizes matters relating to labour. This is a government that currently, through His Excellency Ambassador Matthew Wilson, is chairing the International Labour Organization Executive Committee in Geneva, Switzerland. This is the government who, under the chairmanship of the Minister of Labour, the Honourable Colin Jordan, just recently returned from the ILO, where he would have chaired the committee that would have led and given birth to the decent work, the gig work economy, which is very much driven by young people who work differently than they did in 1951. It's a very different environment. And Barbados remains at the vanguard and at the forefront of countries leading in these efforts. And I am so proud to be able, on behalf of this government, to introduce this 2026 version of this 1951 bill to bring it into a modern environment to meet the needs of today's workers and to ensure that we provide clarity for the 2026 employers of our society. And with these few words, I beg to move that this bill is read a second time.
Just hold 1 second, Senator Walters. We'll take you in a moment.
Senator Walters, please.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. Good morning to all. Welcome to the guests in the chamber. Congratulations to Senator Slocum on his performance in the Pickering Cup finals. Congratulations. Congratulations to Senator Ford. I think I saw in the paper that his band was Large Band of the Year. I'm not sure this. I saw some comments from the Minister of Culture, but it's too early to give congratulations on that. Madam Deputy President, good morning again. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this debate. It's quite an important debate. It's good to have young people in the chamber here today also to listen to some of what is being said. I just have a few points, Mr. President, Madam Deputy President. And I want to kind of open where Senator Cummins ended with the relationship between employee and employer and the importance of that relationship. And I've said in a previous debate that if employees stayed home for a day, the economy would pretty much crash. There's no one to open the doors, there's no one to serve customers, there's no one to conduct business. And on the opposite side, If there is no businesses, then there's no way for persons to earn an income. And then it goes further, because then there's no way for the government itself to earn revenue, tax revenue, corporation tax, etc., so that it could fund the services of the QAH, so it can fund our education system and all of our social services. So the relationship between the two is very important and must never be understated. This bill is one that needs or requires a certain level of support in theory. I think payment of wages is the most important thing. When a person works, they expect to be paid, and they expect to be paid on time. So there is no discord there. You will not find me making comments contrary to the fact that the importance of this bill, payment of wages, is most important or equally important in the relationship between an employee and an employer. But there are a lot of other things that must be taken into account when we speak about the relationship between employer and employee, and also how we treat employment generally in the country. And, you know, we often start to get at odds when we get into the debate, when there's a difference of opinion, or when there are questions that come to the government that hold them to account for some of the things that they have not done, or some of the things that they have promised and not executed, some of the things that they have just pushed by the wayside, so to speak. One of the first things when it relates to labor that I want to discuss in this chamber today is this whole situation of work permits, this whole situation of the environment, the actual labor environment that we are working in now in 2026, and what some employees are facing. And one of the things that they are facing, and what we are seeing coming out in the media space, is the fact that employers seem to be looking outside for work that Barbadians can do, and especially young Barbadians can do. And I've said it before, I'll repeat again, we've seen in recent time posts for store supervisors, warehouse clerks, sales associates. In most recent time, I've seen a post for device repair technician, which is a person that will repair cell phones. I've also seen, on the higher scale, posts for leadership in hotels, Mr. President, Madam Deputy President. And I think this is an opportunity for the government to look at revamping the work permit regime in this country. Because while there is a process that says you can apply and you may not be approved to get that person to come from outside of the country, I think it is a disgrace in 2026 that we should see this level of applications for work permits for these skill sets and these jobs, Madam President. I think we need to revamp this work permit regime to tighten the application process even before it becomes an application, to give direction to the employers on where there's space for application and where there's not, Madam Deputy President. If I go back to the wages of employees, it is very important, and as we know, one of the first things every employee in this country should be paying to Social Security, which is the national insurance scheme. Every employee does not pay to income tax or the pay as you earn because it is based on their earnings. But every person that works should contribute to the national insurance scheme. And this is a call for government to start to have a greater enforcement with employers who are not registered with the National Insurance Scheme. And why is this important? This is important because it may look on the surface that a person might be carrying home a little more extra money because there's not a deduction coming from their wages or their salaries. But in the long run, when there is dependency on the state to support them in any way, they have not contributed, and by default, they are excluded from those benefits. And instead of going to the National Insurance Scheme, they then have to go to the Welfare Department or lean on other services for support. So I think the enforcement of employers registering with the scheme is as important as paying wages on time for all employees. Having a facility, Madam Deputy President, to ensure that workers who have disputes with their employers or their previous employers are treated to in a timely manner is one of the things that was also put in place, I think, back in 2012 with the Employee Rights Tribunal when that came into effect. And over the years, we've seen cases stacking up and stacking up and stacking up. And Mr. President, I may be speaking about labor and labor relations. We also have not only to focus on the private sector and encourage them to do the right thing, encourage them to treat the staff properly, encourage them to pay on time, but there are government institutions who for the past 2 years have had turnover, high turnover. And before the minister must parade about how good the crop over season was, he must see to the affairs at the NCF. And look at the turnover in the NCF, because he was on the board of the NCF before he was the minister. So he is fully aware. He is fully aware of the issues they are having at the National Cultural Foundation with staff turnover. So, Mr. President, we need to manage not only the relationship between the private sector and the labor force, but we need to manage our relationships with the government and the persons that are working for government. There are other situations that we've become aware of, Mr. President, over the years. I think in the NCC, where you have workers, Mr. President, who are not being paid on time, who are working 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. The employment relationship is not good. And the persons really don't have any way else to turn. But we have, or you have as a government, Mr. President, you're a senior, you have, Mr. President, to ensure that the government does all its best to treat the workers properly, not only pay them on time, which they have not done, not only deal with the individual issues within departments, deal with the type of relationships that we have with them in terms of the amount of time they have on work and off work, etc. Not only the deductions that are not coming out of their salary that now prohibits them from obtaining some level of financing. These things need to be addressed, Mr. President. These things need to be addressed. So what I am sure I will hear about today is the minimum wage increase and how well that the government has done to make sure that persons earn more. We've heard it before, Mr. President, and no one is disputing that the minimum wage increase puts more money in your pocket, Mr. President. No one will dispute that. But what we will dispute, Mr. President, is that there are other things that the government needs to turn its attention to so that we can have better labor relationships and a more productive labor force. The government, in the budget this year, the buzzword was productivity. And we do not know how productive we are as a country. There has not been any statistic that I have seen as an opposition senator, as a member of the public. There has been no no statistic I've seen to compare how productive we were in the past to how productive we are now, Mr. President. So I'm not sure if, Mr. President, that the government is working some secret service system and where they are coming up with little sound bites because they have not laid bare the facts so that Barbadians can make an assessment for themselves and so that the private sector or the government itself can start to make the necessary changes to move the country forward. We've also heard about the skills deficit, Mr. President. We've heard about the skills deficit. We heard about a skills deficit. I was privy to a report that gave an idea of where the skills deficit may be. We've heard about the expansion of the hotel sector and having now to have to look for workers, Mr. President.
Honourable Senators, I want to hear Senator Waters very carefully. Press on, Senator Waters.
I'll sit down. Mr. President, we cannot distract from the reality. We cannot distract from the reality. And when we leave in here, most persons on the government side will go back to offices that have civil servants working, who are committed and who deserve the best. Not to be unfeared. Mr. President, I was talking about the skills deficit. And we have to be very careful, or the government should be very careful on how it brands the labor force or the workforce. Because, I don't know, we have so much educated persons, we have persons of a certain intellect in this country, and all we are hearing is that there's a deficit. When you look around this room, there's a deficit, there's a deficit, there's a deficit. Is that what we're telling our young people? That they're not enough, Mr. President? Is that what we're saying? The government will get it and defend it, but the reality is, Mr. President, that there are a set of young people who will not get opportunities in this country come August and September and they finish school. I spoke in a previous debate about having a holistic approach to apprenticeship, to get persons, young people in work full-time. Not only a 6-week, not only a 6-week program, but full-time. I remember the government a few years back had a big program for UB graduates too. Well, they said they had it. We never heard anything after the announcement. Right? We never heard anything about it. They want to live in the past. But we are in the now, Mr. President. And the now requires that we find opportunities for our young people.
I want to raise.
Mr. President, I raise because Senator, on the point of order.
What's the point of order?
Senator Waters is continuously misleading this House. Sir, there are plenty of opportunities through the Division of Youth Affairs. And I said it a few weeks ago, but after he spoke then, he left the House, as he normally does, whether it's going to have something, a burger or two, but maybe he ain't getting them no more. But Mr. President, the truth is that the Division of Youth Affairs have helped over 800 persons over the last 2 years to find employment through the Employability Unit, through the YES, through the Barbados Youth Advanced Corps, and so on. I know that he mentioned about a 6-week program, but Youth Advanced Corps is more than a 6-week program. It is a 2-year program. It is a 6 to 10 week in-house program. But if you read your notes, you'll know that. And he's seriously misleading the House because the division has a lot of opportunities out there for our young people, and we have rolled them out, and I spoke to it a few weeks ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Archer. Continue, Senator Waters.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. I think he read his notes so good that, and they always do this, Mr. President. The government They just read notes. So all they know is what is before them, Mr. President. The Youth Advance Score, I am not talking about those programs. I am talking about persons who are not relying on those programs, who are graduating from university, graduating from BCC, graduating from Samuel Jackson Preston Polytechnic, who deserve equal opportunity in this country. When you look at these type of permits that people trying to import labor, that is what I'm talking about, Mr. President. So I'm not worried about him. He did not address the issues at the National Cultural Foundation, Mr. President. And I hope that by the time he speaks, he will get his notes to address the issues at the National Cultural Foundation.
I think you mean the Honourable Senator.
The Honourable Senator, sorry, yes. Mr. President. But Mr. President,
Mr. President, I raise on a point of order.
What's your point of order, Senator Collins?
Mr. President, the Honourable Senator, I know, is misleading the House. I know he's probably not doing it intentionally, but he is so doing. When he spoke about work permits, the work permits would not be for any government department. The work permits are assessed by a government department, and I'm sure that I have heard the former Minister of Home Affairs, under whose remit the Immigration Department sits, and the current Minister of Home Affairs, under whose remit the Immigration Department still sits, speak to the fact that whether there are 100 or 10 applications for work permits, that does not necessarily translate into approvals of work permits. And so it is erroneous to suggest that the government is stopping young people from getting jobs because of the presence of work permits, because there has been no, and perhaps there should be, a statement said about how many work permits were actually approved, but that does not say that those jobs were granted as applied for.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Please continue, Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I wrap up, it's important to summarize a few things. One, the actual review for the period ending 2023 is overdue. All workers contribute or should be contributing to the National Insurance Scheme, and they deserve the opportunity to see the state, the financial state of the funds under the scheme. Mr. President, the government should take my humble advice and work on enforcement for employers who are not registered with the National Insurance Service, because those persons who are working many years with these organizations will become liabilities of the state in one way or the next, Mr. President. And we need to make sure that we regulate the employment workforce, Mr. President. And I think that some effort must be placed on, one, allowing persons to have the workers or educating workers on the importance of registering, and two, ensuring that those persons who employ workers are themselves registering these persons accordingly, Mr. President. Three, Mr. President, the work permit regime, whether it is approved or disapproved, it needs a revisit at this time, Mr. President, because the type of application we are seeing and the type, I guess, the amount of time then that officials in the department have to deal with these, they could be worth doing something else, Mr. President. But we have to look at the regime, because we can't be having work permits in this country for sales clerks and sales associates and shoe store supervisors and warehouse clerks, etc. And even on a higher level, Mr. President, we've had a tourism industry for decades. And you have leading hotels asking for work permit for a general manager, for people to manage sales and marketing. And I think, Mr. President, that is something that we need to look into, Mr. President, because I am sure that we have the skill sets here, I am sure we have the education here, etc., that we can fill a lot of these posts, Mr. President. And Mr. President, I want the vacation pay to be looked at as well. I'm not sure if it's captured, but I believe that vacation pay should be timely when persons take vacation.
Mr. President, I let it pass.
My friend spoke about the need on a point of order. My apologies. I rise on a point of order. I am friends of all. We have a Holidays with Pay Act, which specifically deals with issues associated with the payment of holidays pay. It's actually required to be paid the day preceding the taking of holiday. So this is not an issue for this piece of legislation. That note should have been read by my friend.
Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes, please wrap up, Senator Walters.
Thank you, Mr. President. One of the things that the government gets wrong, in my view, is that they see this as a tick for tat when we come in this chamber. But I see it also as a point to educate the members of the public who are listening and who are not, Mr. President, aware of some of the things that we are doing in here. So I am very happy for the clarification, Mr. President, to know that these things are covered, and I hope that persons understand that they are due their vacation pay timely. That's all, Mr. President. That is all. So I'm glad I discovered, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, I am happy to support this bill in theory. I think it is important. I think it is important that persons get paid timely. I think it's important, Mr. President, that all workers are respected. And with those few words, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Walters. I'll take Senator Redmond online at this time. Senator Redmond online.
Good morning, Mr. President. I thank you for the opportunity to make my submission on this legislation. And I thank the IT team for facilitating this process, given the fact that I hardly have a voice and I can scarcely breathe. So please bear with me. Can you all hear me?
You're a bit low. Maybe you could come closer to the microphone, given that your voice is not so strong.
Mr. President, I had to speak on this piece of legislation because it is one that directly involves workers in this country. And as the representative of workers, and specifically a certain sector of workers who have suffered immensely because of the lack of provisions that this piece of legislation is seeking to provide, it is incumbent upon me, voice or not, sir, to speak. I will ground my submission in the concept of decent work. It is a concept that embodies both legal and moral tenets. And in fact, the International Labour Organization uses decent work as a framework for promoting opportunities for productive employment with fairness, security, respect for rights, inclusion, social protection, and dialogue, work-life balance, and very importantly, dignity in the workplace. Their views that decent work is a cornerstone of social stability, while others critique it as too broad or aspirational without strong enforcement mechanisms. ILO Conventions 95 and 173 are central to the whole framework of decent work. Convention 95 focuses on wage protection, while 173 safeguards workers' claims when employers become insolvent. Together, they ensure that workers are paid fairly and that their rights are not lost if a company collapses. These two conventions strengthen the decent work agenda in Barbados by linking fair wages with social protection in times of crisis. The decent work agenda, therefore, forms a bridge between economic growth and social justice. Without it, growth can be exploitative, but with it, societies are resilient, they reduce inequality within the society and strengthen democratic participation. Mr. President, there is nothing more exploitative, counterproductive, and indecent about the employment relationship than causing people to work without fair, timely payment for work done. It becomes even more egregious, immoral, and obscene when one considers over 200 years of slavery that has preceded our present condition. To interfere with money in any way that people have already worked for is a problem that Caribbean people, Caribbean employees, should never have to face given our history. It is, however, sadly, too often one that trade unionists have to face and causes great distress to me as president of the Barbados Secondary Teachers Union. The Protection of Wages Act in Barbados is a major modernization of modern law, replacing and repealing the older CAP 351 framework. And in looking at the provisions of this piece of legislation, Mr. President, I will crave your indulgence to allow me to frequently reference its importance, its applicability, and reference to the teaching fraternity. And let me assure you, sir, it is not a narrow lens through which to examine the provisions, but instead I do this to make others aware of the injustices meted out to teachers in the education system in this regard, to hopefully engender a greater appreciation of the commitment and sacrifice of teachers in the system, given number one above, and to leave others far more versed in this legislation's wider application the opportunity of the legislation I have put under certain headings. Payment of wages is one. And in the payment of wages, sections 3.3 and 3.4 are of special importance and relevance to what often presently operates in the education sector. 3.3 states that an employer shall establish for an employee a recurring pay period and a recurring pay day. And B, pay wages earned by the employee during the pay period no later than on the payday for the period and on a normal working day. Section 3.4 states that a contract of employment shall provide for the entire amount of wages of an employee for a pay period to be paid directly to the employee in respect of all work done by him for that period. Mr. President, we have in the education sector, especially at the secondary level, profoundly serious problems with the present absence of legislation in both these areas. The problems emanate mainly from the offices of some, and I repeat some, not all, secretary treasurers to the boards of management in the system. They have the responsibility of entering the necessary data on workers in schools into payment portals to ensure that the teachers are paid, they're paid accurately, and they're paid in a timely manner. Instead, in too many cases, their inaction is directly responsible for causing much disillusionment, frustration, and even anger among members of the fraternity. It must be stated that previously, sections of the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of the Public Service have also been guilty in that regard. But the union must give kudos where it is due, and there has been a marked improvement in facilitating timely pay from those quarters. When people work, they must be paid. However, our teachers' union is flooded with complaints from certain schools, and it is only certain schools, almost on a monthly basis, as this relates to lack of pay. This applies mainly to temporary workers in the system whose paperwork for reassignment to school is not completed or submitted to the Ministry of Education by the Secretary Treasurers in a timely manner. And so some teachers go for months without pay. Needless to say, this is very frustrating, mainly especially to young teachers who, in the first instance, don't even find the teaching salary attractive or the working conditions. And then the added non payment is a major turnoff. It has a serious impact on attracting the type of people we want into the profession and retaining them when they come in. Many of our young, talented teachers leave the system, and sadly, they're the ones qualified to teach high demand, discrete subject areas like mathematics, physics, and geography. They often complain that they cannot work for nothing. Then there are others, Mr. President, who get paid consistently late. That first set are not paid at all for months on end. We have another group who get paid consistently late, long after payday has passed, sometimes as much as 2 weeks. They may be seen to be marginally better off. In June alone, 2 months ago, there were 21 temporary teachers from one school, excuse me, from, from one school alone who were not paid until well after payday. And of course, incurring all of the penalties for late payments of credit cards, bills, mortgages, and having their credit ratings negatively affected. Then, Mr. President, we have circumstances where salaries are incorrectly calculated because either not enough attention is paid to the factors that influence the teacher's placement on the salary scale, or there's ignorance of how these factors actually affect placement, be there acquired qualifications or movement from part time to full time positions. And so we have instances where part time teachers who have become full time teachers are paid part time salaries for months on end, sometimes the whole school year. We have circumstances where, with years' experience and annual increments, persons are not paid those increments. Mr. Speaker, there's a member who, having, she comes to mind immediately, having completed her diploma in education, which allowed her to move 2 increments up on the salary scale, did what was required. She presented that qualification to the Secretary Treasurer's office for confirmation. And having done that, that normally results in your 2 increments added to your salary by the next pay date. It took this person 2 years to get that increment that she was due. And she was constantly being told that the holdup was at the level of the Ministry of Education. She had sent the correspondence off. I asked the member to ask the Secretary Treasurer for a copy of that correspondence. And it's only when that was done that she admitted that she had not, in fact, sent off any correspondence to the ministry. Those are the ways in which some of our members suffer. And these are just some examples. Then we get the problems of payment of allowances for teachers acting in positions of special responsibility, be it as year heads, senior teachers, or heads of department. In many instances, teachers act in these positions for years without payment of their allowances. When the unions check with the ministry, it is often the case that the relevant documentation or minutes from board meetings for the interviews have not been submitted by the Secretary Treasurers, or the information submitted is incomplete. Then we have the problems with non-academic staff because our union also has members among the support staff in the school. We have, for example, watchmen hired by boards of management, And when their increases come into effect, they are not paid. The latest increase came into effect on the 26th of January 2026, and neither back pay nor salary increase has been paid to some of these watchmen by the Secretary Treasurers. Then we have non-payment for the full period of work done, which relates to Section 3.4 of the provisions. In the education sector, sometimes payment for a full holiday period at the end of a term for temporary teachers is contingent upon continued employment at the beginning of the new term. This employment may be at the same or another school. And here, secretary treasurers are often unwilling to pay the teachers for the vacation period, even when they have proof of continued employment. It must also be noted, Mr. President, that when teachers do finally get the large sums of back pay resulting from late payments, inaccurate payments, or hugely delayed payments, a number of things happen. Besides the financial hardship and indignity of the whole thing, the incurred financial penalties I already mentioned, the negatively affected credit ratings, that lump sum is added to their salary, which places them in an extremely high tax bracket for that month, and they lose a substantial portion of that sum in the process. Contrary to popular belief, they do not recover those losses with income tax returns. Mr. President, sir, those are just some examples of the way in which teachers suffer as a result of interference with their salaries, non-payment of salaries, or non-payment of salaries in a timely manner. Excuse me. In looking at provisions related to deductions and advances, we see that employee consent is required for deductions related to advances on third-party payments. Mr. President, there are some secretary treasurers who object to requested deductions from teachers for third-party payments. This obviously creates hardship for teachers whose working hours coincide with those of the banks and other business places, and it means that they have to ask for time off to conduct business, which can otherwise be more readily facilitated at the office of the Secretary Treasurer. The legislation provides that employers may recover overpaid wages, but only through lawful procedures. Again, here, Mr. President, there are many reported instances to the union of monies being deducted from teachers' salaries because they were overpaid. Now, this is no fault of theirs. Often the union has to intervene because there was no formal or other notification of deductions given, no permission was sought or granted from the members, and the amounts deducted as repayment left teachers with less than two-thirds of their salaries. I can think clearly of a case where one teacher got half of her salary deducted for months on end. The legislation also provides for other employee protections. Wages cannot be paid on certain premises to prevent coercion or exploitation. In cases of bankruptcy or insolvency, wages have priority in settlement. Employees can lodge complaints through the chief labor officer, who now has expanded investigative power. The tribunal and enforcement complaints are referred to the Employment Rights Tribunal via the chief labor officer. The tribunal decisions are binding with powers to order repayment of unlawful deductions. Employers face penalties and offenses for breaches, including fines and liability for wage theft. Of course, you know, Mr. President, that public officers do not have access to the chief labor officer or the Employment Rights Tribunal. This legislation, Mr. President, for workers provides stronger safeguards against wage theft, coercive deductions, and exploitative advances. For employers, clearer compliance rules, especially regarding digital payments. For the labor system, enhanced enforcement powers for the chief labor officer and the tribunal ensures fair resolution of disputes in the private sector. Mr. President, in Barbados, we have lots of legislation, but generally too little enforcement. Section 28.1 states that sections 2 to 19 bind the state. And for purposes of those sections, employer includes the state and any public officer or employee acting on behalf of the state in its capacity as employer. Section 28.2 states a breach of this act in relation to an officer or employee of the state shall be deemed to be a grievance under Section 12 of the Public Service Act, Cap 29. And the officer or employee may invoke the procedure with respect to grievance handling set out in the fourth schedule of that act. However, Mr. President, the grievance handling procedure is a lengthy one because the timeframes as outlined in the schedule are often not adhered to by persons as outlined in the schedule. It is often a frustrating and demoralizing process for public officers. I can think of one initiated by the BSTU since 2016, which remains unresolved up until now. There has to be a process of recourse with demonstrably greater effectiveness than the present grievance handling procedure, one that allows for speedier justice. I read recently in an article in the print media written by Michelle M. Russell, where she advocated a fast tracked grievance procedure that would deal specifically with payment matters only. And I think this is worthy of consideration. If we are serious about the equity, fairness, and dignity that underscores the concept of decent work and that acts as a catalyst for this piece of legislation, then certainly other means of redress must be considered in cases where the offending employer is the government. Certainly at the level of the education sector, then the long awaited Teaching Service Commission should be constituted. It is over 50 years in the making, Mr. President, and would certainly relieve the pressure of the over 4,000 public officers from the purview, public officers who are teachers, from the purview of the Public Service Commission in handling such matters. It would definitely reduce much of the frustration, disillusionment, and desperation that some teachers face in being awarded their fair day's pay for a fair day's work and in a timely manner. There must be effective mechanisms to enforce the protection of wages for all workers, and there should be active consideration of the ideal of all workers having justiciable rights in that regard. Further, there needs to be a broad based sensitization of employers and employees of all categories of the contents of this legislation so that they are aware of their respective rights and obligations and the attendant penalties for non adherence now enshrined in law. In relation to sensitization, there must be a focus at the level of the education sector on the training of members of boards of management, especially the chairpersons and the deputies. This training should be done as a prerequisite for appointment to these boards. Many need to understand their roles and responsibilities and where their authority rests. They have to understand that in many instances, they're responsible for the behavior of their secretary treasurers in schools as their employers. Teachers themselves are in dire need of training in the requisite legislations and financial rules, and many need training in personnel relations, as besides complaints from teachers and some chairpersons, there have been complaints from officials at the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of the Public Service from officers there who have been exposed to the behaviors and attitudes of some of the secretary treasurers. In fact, we heard in the other place complaints from the Ministry of Labor in relation to the performance, should I say, of secretary treasurers. All workers in schools, both academic and support staff, have to feel comfortable in their work environment. That is a vital part of the decent work agenda that goes beyond protection of wages. In too many schools, that is not the case. The BSTU has made a recommendation to the Ministry of Education that these persons, these secretary treasurers, be made public officers so that there is greater accountability in the performance of their duties. The Protection of Wages Act 2026 in Barbados modernizes wage law by repealing the older Cap 351, requiring wages to be paid on time and in legal tender, including digital currency, prohibiting exploitative deductions or advances, and strengthening the powers of the Chief Labor Officer to enforce claims of non-payment. It joins other pieces of legislation like the ERA, Severance Payment Act, Minimum Wage Act, Occupational Safety and Health at Work Act, and other public service laws and social protection statutes to underscore the protection of fairness, rights, and dignity in employment, even extending the decent work framework beyond the workplace into broader social security. Protection of wages is a core element of decent work, and this legislation seeks to elevate the concept from simply that of a policy directive. Mr. President, at this point, again, I would like to thank you for allowing me access to facilitate my input into this debate in this format. The provisions of this bill are of serious concern to all workers in the country, but especially to those workers in schools. And I have no hesitation in giving support to this bill. I am obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Redmond, for your contribution. Senator Slocum.
Good afternoon to the Chamber. First, I say good afternoon to you, Mr. President. First, let me express sincere gratitude to my Senate colleagues for their congratulations based upon my contribution to the Crop Over Festival. Whether you made it on the floor, or in private, I truly appreciate them all. I would say, sir, that I would join Senator Cummins, but I would use a different word. I would suggest that Senator Archer had what can be considered a reasonable, successful crop over season, and I congratulate him. There's only one thing that would have made it an exceptionally successful crop over season, but I will not get into that this afternoon. but sir, I have a little, I don't know if it's divine wisdom, it's premonitions, or if it's his technical knowledge of the art form, but Senator Walker and I had an aside before the competition, and I think that he may have been spot on with his understanding of the art form and who would have done reasonably well in competition. But sir, I just want to commend Senator Archer like those who came before me. Sir, I want to first recognize that this amendment first speaks about, the first word in the bill is protection. And when you think of protection, sir, it carries varying meanings. And I say this taking into consideration that when we hear the word protection, we hear other words like safeguarding. We know that often when we hear the word protection, in a previous instance or years ago, it would be that of protecting the physical aspect. But as time has evolved, we know that protection now speaks more so about safeguarding dignity, freedoms, respect for institutions, and some of the more intangible words. And I think that in this instance of this amendment, it does exactly that. It speaks to the intangible. And, sir, the intangible in many instances cannot be seen, but it definitely can be felt. And there's an old-time saying, Bob Marley also has it in the song, who feels it, knows it. And I think that many workers in this country feel the weight of being unfeared. Let me use that word. I think often we find situations where there are issues that are masked, that happens behind closed doors, and we don't often get to see them. This legislation, to my mind, addresses that challenge. It presents an opportunity for legislators, us here in this chamber, to ensure that we protect the most vulnerable in our society. And that is our responsibility. We have to come to appreciate that it is not every instance that we are going to be able to see when a small company does something that goes or contravenes what we anticipate should be the rightful thing to do, which is to ensure that workers in this country are paid in a timely manner. But the truth is, it happens. But, sir, it isn't only just, workers' pay. It is not just about deductions, sir. I think there's a far greater challenge in this society that, truthfully, we cannot afford to ignore. Protection, sir, is about ensuring that unfair treatment is not meted out to Barbadians who cannot help themselves, or who find themselves in positions that they cannot easily stand up to employers, or they don't have access to the knowledge. And essentially, we put a mechanism in place that prevents employers from doing the unjust thing. I know, sir, in many instances where employers in the private sector especially decide that one morning, they're a little short of money, cash flow is a problem, so they can give the employee, half the pay now and the next half a couple months later, a couple weeks later, a couple days later. I know of instances, sir, where people go off on sick leave, maternity leave, and when they go to NIS, their contributions are not there to even get any form of compensation. Sir, we have a serious issue in this country with the way how employers treat labor. I am not satisfied that this legislation solves that problem entirely. And the truth is, it never will. But what we have to do, sir, is to take steps that allows for us to ensure we can protect people as best as we can. But, sir, I want to also digress a bit to the point that truth is, we see this challenge in another space. And, sir, when I speak of government in this instance, I'm not speaking necessarily about the political institution that finds itself being the government of the day, but I more speak to the arm of government that is responsible for its daily operations. Too often, government is found to be culprits of similar actions. I know of situations, and it's not the traditional employee, but those gig workers, persons who are short-term contracts, find themselves also, sir, waiting months for monies owed to them, payments for a period of time, sir, and it presents a serious challenge for those who are trying to meet their daily needs, their living needs, sir. And I want to encourage at this time government to also take serious introspection to its processes, its policies, its approach to how it even treats gig workers. I think this legislation, it stimulates a discussion that needs to go beyond what is just presented here in the bill. We must also take into consideration that as much as we may enter, and it's particularly, sir, in the cultural sector, and I don't want to name any institution. I will not rain on the parade of Senator Archer. I will allow him to celebrate the success of the season that has just passed. But I do want to say it is not just institutions that fall under his remit, but we see it across the government sector. Cultural practitioners, creatives, constantly have a challenge getting their payments weeks, months after their rendered service. It is not just government, however. We see this same challenge in the private sector, especially in the hotel sector, sir. We have a challenge where gig workers, in particular, who may sing on or play an instrument on a Tuesday night, and 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, they're still not being able to receive their payments. Now, some may find it to be a trivial matter, but the truth is, sir, when people cannot go and pay the light bill, when they cannot afford to put food on their table, when they have a challenge, sir, with being able to provide for their children, there is a problem. Something is rotten in the state, not of Denmark, but of Barbados, sir. Because the truth is, I don't know how an employer could feel comfortable knowing that they owe people money, knowing that somebody rendered the service already. You get the person to come and sing in your place, or you commission them to do a piece of work, or whatever you want to call it, especially in the creative sector, sir. And then the next day, the person calling you for your money and you don't answer the phone, okay, check me next week, check me 2 weeks later. And the truth is, this legislation does not necessarily, it isn't applicable to these settings. But I'm calling on government to look at ways in which we can better protect these categories of workers. I also want to say, sir, for considerable time I have served as a director of the Barbados Coalition of Service Industries. And I have come to appreciate that this issue is not particular to that of the creative sector. It belongs to the broader services sector in the country, where people render services and find difficulty in being able to get paid. This is a challenge we must look at. And sir, I also want to support Senator Walters on a point he made earlier. In fact, in another place, I have raised this more than a year ago, and I'm happy that Senator Walters has joined the fight. The truth is, I don't think it is a government problem, but it's a problem that government can be able to assist with. truth is, it isn't comfortable when you see notices published in the newspaper saying that you need, people are applying for work permits for individuals to fill what I call non-skill gaps. You can't tell me that you need a store clerk, a shoe store assistant, a warehouse clerk, some of the most basic jobs, and tell me that you cannot find Barbadians to fill these jobs. Sir, to my mind, that trespasses on the turf of ludicrousy. That you could have individuals, companies, with a level of audacity to publish that in the newspaper and expect Barbadians to lay down and feel comfortable. I want to acknowledge that Senator Cummings made a very valid point. That doesn't mean that government or the department that has responsibility for processing these applications approves them. But I am inclined to know what is the rate, the approval rate, and to have more information about this. Because it begs for us to question what is happening in this particular area. Why are people doing this? Some assume it is for cheaper labor. Some people think it's exploiting migrant workers. And the truth is, we've been seeing in recent times situations in this country that have been very troubling. Sir, so I just ask government once again to share some more information with regards to the work permit application process. And finally, sir, with being as concise as more concise rather than my colleague to my left, but I do want to share this. We have to seriously, sir, contemplate another issue, and that is how we treat to each other as human beings. I mentioned it earlier, I touched on it early in some ways rather, that employers in this country must recognize that employees have responsibilities. But I also recognize that there are other labor-related issues that Barbadians face in terms of the working conditions of which they're in, the way how some are treated by their employers. If anything is to be taken away from this debate today, sir, I hope that this is some level of reminder that employers in this country must recognize that they're dealing with fellow human beings. Do not see employers like that of a colonial period of chattel or any piece of anything knocking around, because it has now become a habitual practice and something that we are seeing too far often in this country. As far as workers being dismissed because they may not be unfairly dismissed, that is, because they don't have maybe the intellectual capacity or they don't have the resources or the people around them to take matters to the Employment Rights Tribunal or to challenge the employers. I think that this is a call for us equally to encourage a reset between the relationship of employers and employees in this country. I do leave the nitty-gritties of this legislation to be debated by the trade unionists in this chamber, and that of Senator Trim and Benjamin. But I do recognize that this piece of legislation fills a gap. And I wish, therefore, sir, to not only lend these few words to the debate, but I also wish to indicate that I support this bill. So that's, sir, I'm much obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Slocum. Senator Sinclair.
Mr. President, I suspended until 3 p.m. No, 3 p.m.
The question is that the Honourable Senate adjourn and the sitting is suspended until 3 p.m. today. Will those Honourable Senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The things the ayes have it. This sitting is suspended until 3 p.m. today.